Zach Edey's gone, and with 4 new schools and 4 new coaches, the Big Ten is wide open heading into this season.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Big Ten Friday here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton, joined today by Isaac Shade, and we are getting you everything you need to know about the Big Ten Conference in our conference preview episode today. Folks, want to thank all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day, and a special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us in our Locked On College Basketball Discord channel. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, like we said, it is another conference preview episode here of the show. We're talking Big Ten basketball, recording this shortly after the Big Ten Media Days. So we've seen some projections from the coaches and media members, some projections for the first team, and we're going to talk all about that. We're talking storylines in the Big Ten. There's 4 new schools joining the conference. There is no longer a gigantic behemoth, or at least not the same gigantic man playing for Purdue. They seem to always have a couple 7-footers on that roster, but no Zach Edey, 4 new schools, some surprise coaching changes in the conference, lots and lots of stuff to get to. We're also going to talk about our preseason predictions for the all first team, some award predictions, and then we'll close out the show talking about ranking the teams in the conference, who we think is going to win the league, and how many of these teams from the Big Ten are going to go dancing. Isaac, let's start with the big storyline. 4 new schools joining the Big Ten, obviously, with pretty much all conference realignment news outside of the most recent conference realignment move. They're about football. They're almost always about football. And Oregon, Washington, UCLA, and USC joining the Big Ten is primarily a move for football, but it adds a lot of interesting elements into this Big Ten conference, a conference that kind of stylistically has been fairly consistent, and now adds schools that don't necessarily fit that style. Obviously, the geography is a big part of it as well. It's going to be really interesting to see how, USC and UCLA are coming off kind of down years. Washington hasn't been good for a while. Meanwhile, Oregon had a pretty good year last year. I think there's a lot of interest in how these 4 schools are going to do, adjusting to a new league, adjusting to the travel while still getting a chance to play each other in the Big Ten this season.
What was it? I was just trying to think, as you were saying, was the last time Washington was good was when Matisse Thybulle was there?
Yeah, Washington has
like an 8-9 seed that year.
Yeah, Washington has a long history of having really good players and not really performing all that well in March. Lorenzo Romar was incredibly notorious for recruiting well and not winning a lot of games. Mike Hopkins kind of followed suit with that. But we'll see how they look this year with Danny Sprinkle. I think maybe they're on the right direction.
But to your point, Andy, it was I remember how floored we were at. I don't think either you or I expected UCLA to be very good last year. I think we were kind of looking at that. I know Leaf was a little bit higher on them, but the USC of it was really shocking last year. And I still can't wrap my head fully around that. So going to be fun to see what these schools add and how the travel of it all is a factor, not only for them, but the teams that have to go out west and what that looks like. So that's obviously a massive wrinkle. Andy, I think one of our favorite storylines year after year after year after year after year, have I said that 23 times yet, is will the Big Ten be able to end their championship drought? Andy, it's up to 23 years now. Purdue, so close, but unfortunately the Danny Hurley buzzsaw was sitting there waiting on them. And I think we thought, that they would eventually be the conference to break it, because the Pac-12 one was going to live on. They've not won it since 97 in Arizona. And we thought that would be dead. But with the resurrection of the Pac-12, how wild would it be if the Pac-12 came back from the dead and broke their championship drought before the Big Ten did? Andy, if I had to ask the question, is this the year that championship drought is broken? Do you have any hope for it?
Not really. I
Yeah.
think last year was the best chance. That Purdue team was clearly one of the two best teams in the country, and they lost to the only other team that was one of the clear best top two teams in the country in UConn. I mean, it was one of those things where, you as a fan of the sport, a lot of times you want to see 1 versus 2. You want to see Goliath versus Goliath, and that's what we got in that national championship game. And while I have a lot of optimism that Matt Painter and Purdue they're going to continue to be very good. I don't think that Zach Edey leaving is going to push this program off a cliff or anything like that. But they didn't win it last year with Zach Edey, and this year they don't have him. I mean, they have their guard group is still there, and Smith and Lawyer and Trey Kaufman-Wren's going to step into a bigger role. But they also lose Mason Gillis. They also I just don't think are as championship ready. And looking at the rest of the teams in the conference, there's a handful of teams that are top 25 caliber programs, but nobody that I feel is a clear favorite to be a national championship contender. The teams we're talking about in that conversation are Kansas and Alabama and Houston and Baylor and Duke, Gonzaga, North Carolina, like teams that just aren't in the Big Ten. So I think this is going to be a strong conference this year, but I don't get the sense that there's a lot of teams in this league that are true contenders to win the national championship in 25. So I think the streak lives on.
I'm right with you. I would love for it to end, and it could, like who knows which in the transfer portal era, which team will pop.
Yep.
But as we sit here preseason, and I think part of the equation, Andy, is that there are other teams in other conferences that I think we see as pretty clearly being much better. And that's part of it too. It's not just Big Ten in a vacuum. So that for me is part of the factor. Andy, we've mentioned the new schools. There are also 4 new coaches, some of which is overlap. We've got Danny Sprinkle that replaces Mike Hopkins at Washington, who we mentioned earlier, coming over from Utah State. Oh, by the way, bringing great Osobor with him. What a great move. Jake Diebler replaces Chris Holtman at Ohio State, which he actually did down the stretch last season, but now it's in. Dusty May finally made a move away from FAU, but to a different Big Ten school than maybe a lot of us thought he would do. Winds up at Michigan, replacing Juwan Howard. And then the Muss Bus is part of the whole wacky coaching carousel that wound up with some SEC major changes, brings Eric Musselman to USC, replacing Andy Enfield. Andy, my question then next is, which of these 4 new coaches has the best season this year?
It's going to be really interesting to see how they do. I mean, we've already seen Diebler do it at Ohio State. His team went 8-3 last year down the stretch. That was part of the reason he managed to keep that job. He was hired on an interim basis after Chris Holtman was fired before the end of the season. I like Ohio State's moves a lot this offseason. I think he's a very strong candidate for it, but I think I'm going to go with Dusty May. I think it's probably the more obvious pick. He was the most high-profile mid-major coach to make a move this offseason, very close alongside Pat Kelsey, who goes over to Louisville. But I think Dusty May brought some tremendous talent with him. He wasn't able to land his trio of talent from FAU, but he did bring Vlad Golden over, the big man in the middle. They got Danny Wolf from Yale. They had some other really high-profile additions. I think he's a fantastic coach. I think Michigan is a program that's really ready to pour some money and pour some support into that program. So I'm leaning with May being the guy in year 1 in terms of the most successful, and I'm also expecting him to be the most successful long-term out of this group. I think obviously Eric Musselman has proven to be a tremendous coach, but this roster is completely overhauled. I think they have 11 or 12 additions in the transfer portal, and while I think the talent is there, we saw some issues at Arkansas last year with a huge transfer portal class, and so I'm not sure that the pieces are going to be put together in time for USC to have a super dominant year 1. While I think that eventually Muss will find his way at USC, depending how long he stays there, I think May is my pick for short-term and long-term in terms of most success out of these 4 new coaches.
Andy, when I answer this same question, I start with who I don't think it'll be. I don't think it'll be Danny Sprinkle this year, although I think he's a great coach, and I hope he can get Washington back going. I agree with you. I don't think it's Musselman this year. And so it comes down for me to either Dusty May or Jake Diebler. And I truthfully, I like what both coaches have. I think Michigan's a little deeper than Ohio State. But with Diebler having already been there and been in place, and with Thornton still there running the show, I'm going to go with Diebler for this year, but I very much, I think Dusty May is an easy 1B for me.
Yeah. When talking about the new schools in the conference too, obviously we just talked about Musselman and we just talked about Danny Sprinkle, so we don't need to relitigate that too much. But the other two new schools are UCLA and Oregon. Of course, Mick Cronin's squad was not very good last year, underperformed. Oregon was kind of middling throughout the year, got hot at the end of the year, made a nice run in the NCAA tournament. I'm guessing that if we're picking who we think is going to be the best of the four new schools, we're probably picking out of those two.
I agree.
Who do you think it's going to be this upcoming season?
First off, I agree with that assessment that it will be UCLA or Oregon. And Andy, what's funny is I've gone back and forth on this because I think both are, top half of the Big Ten type of schools. I think both coaches are too good. I think I'm ultimately going to lean Oregon because I believe in Jackson Shellstat a lot. And not that I don't think, I know I'm looking at the preseason projections from the voting, and they've got UCLA third, Oregon sixth, but I don't know. I've got a feeling about Oregon kind of taking a step forward, and after maybe I'm burned by UCLA last year, and I can't give them the benefit of the doubt, but I'm going to go Oregon.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm going to go with Oregon as well. I think that a lot of pieces need to come together. They had some injury issues last year. If KJ Evans can kind of take a step forward as a bit of a sophomore breakout candidate, along with Shellstad. Mookie Cook only played 5 games last year, but he was a really highly regarded freshman as well. So I think there's Nate Biddle only played, I think, 5 or 6 games last year. Keyshawn Bartholomew, their transfer guard from Colorado, only played 15 games. They had a lot of guys who were hurt. And if those guys are healthy and if the sophomores kind of take a leap, you need a lot of things to align. But if they do, Dana Altman's got a really good team, a team that's more than capable of finishing in the top 5, arguably the top 3 of the Big Ten this upcoming season. Again, things need to fall the right way, and I'm a little worried about their front court, especially with N'Faly Dante not getting that extra year of eligibility that he was hoping he would get. I think that's a bit of a question mark for them. They land Supreme Cook in the transfer portal out of Georgetown, but he's fine, but he's not a big-time addition necessarily. But yeah, I like what Dana Altman's got going for him, and I think if the stars align, this team could be really good.
Andy, quickly before we move on, you mentioned it in the cold open, so I want to make sure we get to this here in this first segment. Last year, Purdue was the biggest no-duh of any of the major conferences because of Zach Edey, because what they were bringing back. This year, I'm more intrigued about the Big Ten because it's so wide open at the top. Purdue, we think, should be there, but there's several of these kind of remade teams like Michigan bringing in so much that seems like they could be good. Indiana, is UCLA good enough? Did Ohio State do enough? There's always Tom Izzo. There's Illinois bringing back I don't think Rutgers is going to be in that mix, but you've got these 2 uber talented freshmen who are probably going to be both lottery picks next year in Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper. What can they do for the Scarlet Knights? I don't think a ton, but Andy, I think that is a super fun storyline to watch with this conference.
Yeah, I think there's a handful of teams. Michigan's among them. Indiana's among them. I think Ohio State's among them. I think Rutgers and even Maryland and UCLA and Oregon, where if you told me they finished second, I would be maybe sort of surprised, but not shocked. And if you told me they finished 9th, I'd be sort of surprised, but not shocked. And that's less about those individual teams and more just, I think that the difference between 2 through 7 or 8 in this conference, it can go a lot of different ways. If Washington finished 3rd, I would be surprised. It's not every team necessarily in that conversation, but Indiana's got a new look roster. Michigan, Ohio, like we mentioned, they got either new coaches or new rosters, or they're new to the conference. There's so much variables for so many of the teams that kind of feel like they're going to be in that conversation as top 8, top 10 teams in this league. And I really think anybody who projects how the Big Ten is going to finish 1 through 10 or so with a ton of confidence, I'm just not sure how you can have that much confidence with the amount of variables there are in this league. And I think that's going to make it fun to watch.
100% it will. And it reminds me, as you were talking, it triggered something when you were saying 2nd or 9th or whatever. 2 years ago, Purdue won this conference again by 3 games. They were 15-5. Indiana was 2nd at 12-8. And you go all the way down to Nebraska, which was 3rd from the bottom. How many was that? 14, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Nebraska was 12th, just 3 games back. They were 9-11. And so there was a 3-game gap from 2nd to 12th in this conference, Andy. And I think we very well could be looking at that exact sort of situation all over again this year. And honestly, that's what we're here for, man. Let's make it crazy right up until the end of the regular season. All right, Andy, we said it already. Zach Edey being gone means there's actually a little mystery this year as to who will be not only the national player of the year, but the Big Ten player of the year. Although, is his former point guard a clear front runner? We're going to discuss that and all of our superlatives coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about our friends at FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start this season with a big return on FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And right now, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. How about it, Andy? We've got the Big Ten conference odds at FanDuel out already. Purdue leads the way at plus 360. Not very confident, as we've said, followed by Indiana at plus 650. Sparty at plus 700, and a tie between UCLA and Ohio State at plus 850. So if you want to get in on that action or any of the other conference odds, go check it out at FanDuel.com. You know it. It's America's #1 sportsbook. Andy, it's time for our superlatives. We cannot put Zach Edey on this list any longer, although maybe we should because his spirit lives on so well. But Andy, what we're going to get to first is our first team choices. Folks, let me remind you that part of the way we do this, because we want to spread the love around and just honestly, a big part of this is just helping you get to know the names of the Big Ten Conference. And so we refuse to pick two players from the same school for our first team list. So with that said, Andy, who are your 5 first-team All-Big Ten players?
Frankly, that's a lot easier in a conference that has as many teams as the Big Ten. It's not. There weren't too many times where I was like, "Oh, I really wish I could pick 2 players from the same team." But starting off with our Purdue player, we talked about him in the cold open. It's Braden Smith. I think Braden Smith was the easiest player to select for the Big Ten first team. Just lock him in, move on from there. After that, I got a pair of transfers coming into the conference, both big men. Umar Ballo transferring from Arizona to Indiana. He's been highly productive for the last couple of years in Tommy Lloyd's program. I think that's going to continue for Mike Woodson and the Hoosiers. Great Osobor, we talked about him earlier, was fantastic at Montana State playing for Danny Sprinkle, was fantastic at Utah State playing for Danny Sprinkle. I think he's going to be fantastic at Washington playing for Danny Sprinkle. I don't see any reason for that to change. And while I don't think Washington will be all that good, I think Osobor will put up the kind of numbers necessary to be on this first team. Then we got Jackson Shellstad, a bit of a breakout candidate for the Oregon Ducks, and coming into his sophomore year, he was very good as a true freshman point guard last year. I think we're going to see him take that leap in Dana Altman's system. And then I got a guy who many people thought would stay in the NBA draft process. He ultimately ended up returning to Iowa. That's Peyton Sanford, a pure outside shooter, and a guy I think is going to put up some really big numbers for the Hawkeyes this season.
Andy, great choices there. I've got 3 of the same, so we'll not relitigate those. I'm with you on Braden Smith. I've also got Peyton Sanford. Anytime you can get back an NBA talent to come and play, that's a big deal and also should be right here. And I've also got great Osobor on mine. I went my other 2 that I didn't have aligned with you. So I left off Umar Ballo and Jackson Shellstad. But I do have Bruce Thornton at Ohio State. Part of it is this. He took a big step forward last year as a sophomore for Ohio State, 15.7 points a game, up from 10.6, from 2.6 assists a game, up to 4.8. Andy, while lowering his turnovers last year, which is really impressive to me. His steals went up, free throw shooting went up to 85%. And so just really solid job. I'd like to see his 3-point shooting come back up. But another part of it, Andy, is I think he's got better talent around him this year. Michi Johnson comes in to share the backcourt with him from good grief, South Carolina. You've got Sean Stewart coming over from Duke. You've got Aaron Bradshaw coming over from Kentucky, homie from San Diego State, who I can't think of right now, Micah Parrish. And so I just like what he's got around him to not only be able to score, but to distribute. And so I think that makes a ton of sense. And then, man, I just love Vlad Golden, and I think he's going to be massive, literally and figuratively, for Michigan this year. And same kind of thing. I like the talent around him. I think he and Danny Wolf can play well together in that Michigan front court, and I think that'll work. So I'm going with Vlad Golden as my 5th. I know, somebody else I considered was Dawson Garcia at Minnesota. I just can't do that because Minnesota's awful. So there is my top 5. So Andy, out of those 5, who did you select for your Big Ten Player of the Year?
Yeah, it's not. Last year was basically Zach Edey or the field, and I don't think it's quite that this year. Last year, I probably would have bet Edey over the field legitimately. Definitely not doing this year, but I am taking one of his teammates. I'm taking Braden Smith. He's such a dynamic talent, so versatile in what he can bring. He's just an elite guard on both ends of the floor. He's cerebral. He's a great outside shooter. I think he's going to get the keys to the kingdom to do a little bit more offensively now without Edey in the mix. So I think there's other great candidates. I don't think it's nearly as cut and dry as it has been in the past, but I think Braden Smith's the front runner, and I think he should be.
Well, I tell you what, my friend, that's who I've got as well. So I'm not going to say more about it. Let's move to transfer of the year. And Andy, let's just recognize this off the top. There are so many phenomenal transfers in this conference, along with the SEC. Does the money have a big factor in that? Absolutely it does. We need to continue to talk about that. But man, it's just talent flooding into this conference. And so, Andy, who do you have for your transfer pick of the year?
I went with Osobor at Washington. Again, I had 2 transfers on my top 5 first team. You had 3 on yours. So we're looking at a situation where actually you only had 2 on yours, but we're looking at there's just so many good transfers in this conference. Again, we didn't even talk about anybody at USC, despite the fact that they have 11 new transfers on that roster. Like, it's just a litany of talented players, but Osobor has just been so productive in Danny Sprinkle's system. I think he's going to continue to be. I wouldn't be surprised to see his numbers from last year look pretty similar at Washington, like 17, 18 points a game, 6, 7, 8 rebounds like that. And sure, Ballo and Golden and et cetera, are going to be in this conversation. But even though I don't think Washington's going to be very good, give me Osobor to win that transfer of the year.
I thought about Osobor. I thought about a bunch of people, maybe Aaron Bradshaw having a blow up this year at Ohio State. You know, he was hurt coming in last year. I ultimately went with Vlad Golden at Michigan. He has continued to progress year after year after year at FAU. I know he's at a new school, but he's with his same coach who knows how to utilize him well. And so give me Vlad Golden as my choice for transfer player of the year. Andy, let's now switch to freshman of the year. As a reminder, when other people cop out and do newcomer of the year, now we still got transfer and freshman of the year. And Andy, based on conversations you and I have had, I think we're picking somebody different than the Big Ten media did for their preseason freshman of the year. Who did you go with?
Yeah, I'm going with the other player at Rutgers. Dylan Harper, I think, is the consensus pick. I'm going with Ace Bailey. I like him a little bit better. I think his game translates a little bit faster to the Big Ten. I just think I think both are going to be great. I really do. I think it's, I think they're both really talented. I think they both fit the system there, but I just think Bailey's going to put up numbers that are more in line with what it would take to win this award. So I'm going with Bailey, but it's very close between the two of them. There's some other good options as well.
It's so funny. I mean, I'm looking at the preseason stuff here from the Big Ten. Not only did Harper won freshman of the year, he was on the first team preseason All Big Ten with Baldwin on the second team. And Andy, did Ace Bailey? I said Baldwin. Ace Bailey on the same. That's going to be one of the hardest things for me this season. We might have to start apologizing not only to the lawyers but to the Aces.
To the Ace Bs.
To the Ace Bs, yes. But I think I wanted to pick Harper just to go different than you. I just can't, though. I think Bailey, to me, is clearly the choice here. And we've got some other great freshmen. Obviously, Derek Queen at Maryland. Oh gosh, what's his name at Illinois? Jack Kusionis is going to be really good as well. So Andy, let's now flip to the DPOY defensive player of the year. And interestingly enough, we have 2 returning players from last year's first team All Big Ten defensive team. Did you go with either of those for yours?
I did. I went with the other Ace B, Ace Baldwin from Penn State. 2.7 steals a game last year. He's got active hands. He's a phenomenal defensive player, hard-nosed, physical. I like the style that he plays with. Again, it's somewhat similar to the Osobor projection in the sense that I don't really think Penn State's going to be all that good, but Baldwin's such a talented player that I think he's going to end up being so good defensively that he wins this award, even on a team that's not very good.
Oddly enough, I chose the other returning defensive, the player that was on the defensive first team last year, and that's Northwestern's Brooks Barnhizer, who I see continuing that work and being this year's Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. Andy, let's wrap up our superlatives with Coach of the Year.
Yeah, there's a lot of good options here. I went with Dana Altman again. We kind of talked about Oregon as potentially being the best of the newcomers. They're not projected to be that. They're projected to finish kind of in that 7 to 10 range in the Big Ten, maybe top 5. I think there's a real chance that Oregon finishes 4th, maybe even 3rd. Again, a lot of the things have to come together for them, like we said. But Dana Altman in a new conference, having a lot of success, being a top 6, 7, even top 5 team in the Big Ten is probably enough for him to take this award home. And I think deservedly so if he can get the Ducks team in that conversation.
I'm going with Matt Painter, and I recognize there might be some voter fatigue because he won it last year, but I'm always trying to look for like, what's the storyline that gets people to vote? And it's like, you lost the back-to-back national player of the year and still you won this conference, which is a spoiler alert look ahead to my choice. And so I just think people look at that and say, wow, way to go, Matt. However, so I'll say if there is voter fatigue and if Indiana winds up top 3, we've railed against Mike Woodson and his hot seatness. If Indiana can finish top 3 in the Big Ten, I think Mike Woodson wins it.
Well, we're going to close out the show talking about our tier list for the Big Ten, where all these teams kind of come in heading into the season. We're also going to talk about how many teams from this conference we think are going to go dancing in 2025. All of that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about Gametime, because going to live events, it's the best. Whether it's theater, whether it's music, whether it's comedy, and now we got college sports back too. Football is back. Basketball is just about on the way back, about a month out right now from that first game, Gonzaga-Baylor on November 4th. Going to be an absolutely beautiful day of college hoops. I'm looking forward to making a ton of new memories this college sports season. And the great news is when you're getting tickets for this year, Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of different tickets. Whether it's Gametime's ticketing coverage, their lowest price guarantee, or the panoramic views from your seat in the app, Gametime has you covered. January 12th, Purdue at Mackey Arena, they will host Dylan Harper, Ace Bailey, and that Rutgers Scarlet Knights squad. You can get 2 tickets to that game right now in section 102. Beautiful views, $100 a pop, part of Gametime's super deal. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, Isaac, closing out the show today, continuing our Big Ten Conference preview here as we're recording this right during the Big Ten Media Day. We got a lot of fun stuff coming out of that event. And what we want to do now to close out the show is talk about our tier list. We got 5 different tiers where we placed each of the schools in the Big Ten. We're going to talk about what we agree on, disagree on, and then we're going to close out the show predicting our regular season champions, our conference tournament champions, how many of these teams are going to go dancing, and if we have time, maybe relitigate if we think any of these teams might win it all and end that long streak of not winning the big dance out of the Big Ten. Isaac, we'll start. I'm going to read you my first 2 tiers here. I've probably said this for most of the conference shows we've done, but this was really hard. This is a conference where there's a lot of variability kind of pretty much throughout. There's a few not so good teams, a few great teams. Everybody else, I feel like you could do it a lot of different ways. I put 3 teams in the tier 1, Purdue, Illinois, and Michigan State. And then I put 4 teams in tier 2. 2 of them are newcomers in UCLA and Oregon. One of them is Mike Woodson's Indiana team. The other one, probably the more controversial pick, is that Rutgers squad with those 2 dynamic freshmen. Not sure that they finished quite this high, but felt like they deserve to be in that tier with how exciting this team is going into the season.
Yeah, Andy, honestly, that is my biggest thing I would switch is putting Rutgers. I mean, I'm not terribly lower, but I would have them in like the bottom part of tier 3 personally. It's interesting on Illinois and Michigan State. Like, I can't decide who I think are teams like 2 through 5 in this conference. I kind of alluded to it a little bit ago. I think Purdue actually will win the regular season again, so I would have them in tier 1. But honestly, I could kind of have all 7 of those because I think I would personally switch Rutgers and Ohio State and maybe even put Michigan a little higher. But I would almost group all of those in one tier because it's so jumbled up. I got no problems with you splitting it up, but I feel like they're so undifferentiated from one another that it's like this large upper class for the Big Ten. And then a bunch of like, honestly, the strongest thing I feel about is that Minnesota is going to be at the bottom. Like outside of that, I don't, and maybe Penn State right above them. Like that is easier to me than the top part of this conference. And again, that's what I think is going to make it a super watchable and super fun conference this year, which, as we talked about on their conference reveal show, is going to have games like almost every day once we get into 2025. And that to me, my friend, is super exciting. So behind the scenes, folks, Andy put our tiers together. Andy, as you relook at it now, are there any others that you would move around from what you initially did?
Maybe.
Or do you love past Andy?
Tier 3, I got Ohio State, Michigan, Iowa, and Maryland. And looking at that, I think I might bump Maryland down to tier 4. I'm not super confident about the Terps this year.
No.
And I think Ohio State and Michigan are a tier above them, but perhaps maybe they should just be bumped up a tier. Rutgers bumped down a tier. There's a couple of different ways to do it. And then I have Wisconsin, USC, and Nebraska, all in that 4th tier. It felt like they didn't quite belong in the absolute last tier. So USC is an incredibly impossible team to really predict for this upcoming season. So you can't really go wrong putting them anywhere because they're just really hard to know what that's going to look like. And you were correct in saying Penn State and Minnesota at the bottom, Northwestern right above them. And then I got Washington in that 5th tier. I think they could easily be up in that 4th tier. It's not a huge difference either way. But yeah, once you get past like 10 or 11, I think those last few teams are a little bit easier to project, but it's like 2 through 9 or 10 that could go so many different directions.
You know, something that stands out to me is it's sad to see Wisconsin this low in our rankings, right? We're used to them. So I'm curious to see what they can do to raise up. Andy, let's make some postseason predictions here. Who is your regular season Big Ten champion? I guess I should go ahead and say mine just because I've been alluding to it. Mine's Purdue. I know they lose Zach Edey, but legitimately, I think Trey Kaufman-Renn steps right in and has a very productive year. I know they also lose Mason Gillis to Duke, but I think the things are there. Matt Painter's just great coach. Yeah. And I think that backcourt, what I'm really excited about is seeing the Lawyer Smith backcourt just continue to take steps forward, and thinking back to how we had to say, you know, their freshman year, what they were doing. But man, these two dudes have been around the block, and I think it's going to be a great year for Purdue.
Yeah, I feel like criticizing Purdue's backcourt was something that kind of happened a lot as they were freshmen. It wasn't even like direct criticism as much as like, hey, this team could be really good, but they have some youth in the backcourt, and that might kind of hold them back. And now that's not even part of the conversation at all. They're what's going to bring Purdue forward. I'm with you. I have Purdue winning the regular season. I think that guard group is so good. I think Kaufman-Renn is we've seen bigs, you know, obviously Edey among them, step into bigger roles in Painter's system and thrive immediately. I think Kaufman-Renn is going to do that. Between him and the 2 backcourt guys, I think this team is ready to roll. And I think Matt Painter's the best coach in the conference. And I think that combined with having some veteran guards is enough for them to win the league.
But I'll tell you this, it ain't going to be about 3 or 4 games again. You can take that to the bank. All right, Andy, conference tournament where Purdue last year lost to Wisconsin that we just talked about in overtime. Does Purdue win the conference tournament as well or no?
I'm going Michigan State. It's hard to bet against Tom Izzo in March. And I think that this team, they have a lot of youth, a lot of guys who are rising sophomores who I think are going to be really good by the end of the regular season here. I think this team's going to be really kind of hitting their stride, as we see so often with Izzo teams towards the end of the year. I think they're going to be within striking distance of winning the regular season. I just think they're good enough to do that. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're playing their best basketball towards the end of the year, and that results in them winning that conference tournament.
I've got Ohio State kind of stepping in. I think that might be a little bit out of left field for some folks, but I mentioned it earlier. I love the Thornton-Michie Johnson backcourt. I think Micah Parrish's postseason experience with San Diego State plays into this in a big way. And I like Sean Stewart and Aaron Bradshaw, and I think they could both have breakouts transferring in from Blue Bloods. The biggest question to me is, what happens after that, though? But in a tournament moment where you're playing your starters bigger minutes, I think that could be really good. Obviously, the question is, does Coach Diebler save some of that back for hopefully NCAA tournament run? We'll have to see on that. Andy, NCAA tournament, how many teams are getting in from the Big Ten?
I got 9 teams making it from the Big Ten, which feels like a lot. And I feel like a lot of them are going to be in that like 7 to 10 seed range, which is honestly something we see so often with some of the bigger conferences. There's the amount of 8-9 matchups that are like Big 10 versus
Yeah.
Big 12 or Big
Yeah.
10 versus SEC games. It just feels like that's kind of what we're used to. I got Purdue, Michigan State. I got two of the newcomers, UCLA and Oregon as well. I got Ohio State, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, and then probably the more controversial pick, which is Rutgers. Again, I think Steve Peichel is a good coach. I think this team is going to do enough to be in that conversation. Those two freshmen are just so good that I think it's enough for them to win the kind of games that puts them on the bubble. And frankly, I think if they're on the bubble, they're going to slide their way in just because people really want to see what those two young kids can do in March.
Andy, what's funny is I have 8, and literally the difference for me was Rutgers. As much as I hate it, because we won our most talented players in, because that's what brings the general public eyeballs. I just don't think it's going to be enough. If Cliff Omori was still there, which I'm like, why did he leave? He could have had a massive year playing with these two dudes. Anyway, I'll let that be for another day. But if Cliff Omori was still there, I'd have him in. He's not. And I think the freshmen are uber talented. I just don't think the team has enough to make it in. Andy, that's been fun for our Big Ten preview. I always love doing these conference preview shows together. If you want to hear more of this, either our team previews or our conference previews, man, make sure you are subscribed to us both on video and audio so that you don't miss a second of Locked On College Basketball. Also, we're talking about this all the time in our Locked On College Basketball Discord. That link is in the show notes, and it's absolutely free to join. Yes, free. You heard us correctly. Guys, we say it all the time. Apologies to the lawyer family. I guess I got to add in now. Apologies to the Ace Bs out there. And let's go Wildcats. Northwestern, I guess, is who we're rocking with today. But until next week, peace.